Dorothea Helen Gray, also known as Dorothea Puente. Dorothea Puente was born on January 9, 1929 in Redlands, California. Both of Dorothea's parents were cotton pickers and alcoholic. Her father died of tuberculosis when Puente was 8, while her mother routinely abused her and her siblings and died in a motorcycle accident a year later. Dorothea Puente orphaned, and her siblings splintered off in different directions, bouncing between foster care and relatives' homes. Puente struck out on her own when she was 16. She went to Olympia, Washington, where she tried to make a living as a prostitute in motels. Instead, Puente found a husband. She met and married a soldier named Fred McFall in 1945. Their marriage lasts only for 3 years. They had two children but didn't raise them. They were sent for adoption. After their divorce, she went to California. There she started her crime life in 1948. She was convicted of felony of writing fictitious checks and was sent in prison for 4 months. And in 1952, she married her second husband, Alex Johansson. They often argued about Dorothea's vices, such as drinking and gambling. And when her husband knew that she was offering sex to an undercover agent, her husband sent her to a psychiatric ward. But despite that, their marriage lasted for 14 years and ended on 1966. Dorothea's following marriages were short-lived. 2 years after, she married Roberto Puente, and it lasted only for a year and 4 months. Then Puente married Angel Montalvo, but he left her after a week only after their wedding. In her 40s, during the 1970s, she opened her boarding house in Sacramento. In 1982, where she started her murders, Malcolm Mackenzie, a 74-year-old man found to be paralyzed in his apartment. He accused Puente of drugging him and stealing his valuables. She pleaded guilty to 5 felonies charged with 2 grand thefts, forgery, and administering stupefying drugs. After that, she had a friend and business partner named Ruth Monroe, as shown in the picture below. Since Ruth's husband just died of cancer and she had no companion, she asked to live with Puente. While in Puente's place, Ruth's son came to visit her often, and that day, the last time he visited, she was well and healthy. But the following day, to their surprise, Ruth was found lifeless in her bed. Puente immediately called the police that Ruth committed suicide because of depression, because of the loss of her husband. An autopsy showed all toxic levels in her system. And during this time in 1982, there was still no way to determine that Ruth didn't commit suicide. And apparently, Ruth's belongings were gone, and only an empty purse was left. While serving her sentence, she had a 77-year-old pen pal boyfriend, Everson Gilmore. And when released in 1985, they opened a joint bank account. And in the same year, she hired a handyman named Ismael Flores to install wood paneling in her home. And after he completed the job, Puente paid him $800 bonus and gave him a red 1980 Ford pickup truck, the exact same model and year of Gilmore's car, her boyfriend. She told Flores the handyman that the truck belonged to her boyfriend who gave it to her. Puente also hired Flores to build a box that was 6 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet, which she stated that she would use to store books and other items. They dumped and she asked help from Flores to dump the box in a riverbank, and 2 months after, the box was recovered by a fisherman who called the police immediately. When the police arrived at the scene and opened the box, they found the decomposed remains of an elderly man who would not be identified as Everson Gilmore her boyfriend, for another 3 years. And during this time, Puente collected Gilmour's pension and forged letters to his family. So this time, Puente realized she needed to change her style. She was posing as a very knowledgeable, innocent old lady with her chiffon dress, thick-rimmed glasses, and gray hair. Dorothea Puente looked like a sweet old lady. She continued to house elderly and homeless tenants in her boarding house, and was frequently visited by many. Because of this, she was well loved by her community, since she gives donations, participates in charity events, and joined different organizations. As seen in the photo, Puente had a picture with California Governor George Decomejian, and she was very active in the community. She targeted those who had no family to look after them or monitor their whereabouts. And this was a perfect fit for Puente's murder scheme. Once tenants moved in, Puente started stealing their money under the guise of managing their finances. She would either open a joint account with a tenant or forge and cash the tenant's checks and keep the funds in her own account. Between 1982 and 1989, Puente would take in the vulnerable and homeless, poisoning and strangling some of her tenants before burying them on her property and cashing their social security checks. This went unnoticed for more than 7 years, until suspicions first arose when a social worker, Judy Moyes, who also spoke in a Netflix documentary, The Worst Roommate Ever, she reported that Albert Montoya went missing. This Albert Montoya was sent to Puente's house of care by Judy Moyes. Judy Moyes filed a report to the Missing Person Unit Department. This time, authorities were already involved, and John Cabrera, the picture on the lower right, the homicide detective in charge of the Missing Person Unit, together with parole officers, visited her house and asked to do a search. Puente permitted them, and no suspicious evidence were found. They also had the permission to dig the yard, and Puente agreed, even providing an extra shovel for them to do so. And after the search in the backyard, what they found were pieces of cloth, eggshells, and leather pieces that looked like beef jerky. And finally, the police realized what they thought was beef jerky was actually human flesh. And as they dig deeper and deeper, they recovered femur bones and other body parts. And because of this, Dorothea was invited to the police department for questioning, but she denied everything. And because there was insufficient evidence, she was asked to go home for the evening. However, the following morning, a team of forensic experts and other police officers did a thorough investigation in her property. While doing this, she said she was anxious and need to come down and buy coffee across the street and just visit the shop across her home. But but she escaped her way out on a bus to Los Angeles, Southern California. And the officers didn't notice this, and meanwhile authorities recovered 6 more bodies in the backyard. And because of this, the police released a wanted person report on media. And in Los Angeles, she lived with an assumed name, Donna Johansson. And when she was there in LA, she hangs out in bars, and she found this man where he dated. But unfortunately, this man recognized her as a wanted person. And after 5 days, she was arrested in the motel where she was staying. And when interviewed, she said, I have not killed anyone. The checks I cashed, yes, I used to be a very good person at one time. In July 3, 1990, Puente was charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder for the 7 bodies found at her house, in addition to Gilmouth and Montoya. She was convicted of 3 of the murders as jury could not agree on the other 6. Puente was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, which she served at Central California Women's Facility in Madera County, California. She died with a natural cause on March 27, 2011, at the age of 82. Dorothea's uh, modus operandi is that she drugged all her victims to death and stole all their possessions. And this case typically involves a serial killer. Her number of victims are 9, but she was only convicted of 3, and her murder schemes lasted for 7 to 8 years. This case, as we can see, typically involves a serial killer. And who would have thought that the innocent, sweet old lady is a psychopath serial killer? A traumatic childhood can be distressing for anyone and can often have lifelong effects. This is especially true for some serial killers. According to a study by Michelle and Ahmed, 74% of serial killers suffered from psychological abuse as a child, and 42% suffered from physical abuse from a young age. This is not saying that every case of abuse as a child leads to a child becoming a criminal, but it has been proven that there is a heightened risk associated with childhood trauma and antisocial behaviors for personality disorders and criminal activity later in life. The serial killer group being tested in this study reported 6 times more abuse during childhood than the general population. This shows what disastrous effects a traumatic childhood can really have on a person. Not all the killers in this study necessarily suffered from physical abuse in their early years. This could be anything from psychological, sexual, or even witnessing sexual or physical abuse against another. Other historical factors common in serial killers are trauma, insecure attachment, loss or abandonment of a parent or caretaker, antisocial behavior, head injury, and low arousal levels. Familial contributions include the physical absence or lack of personal involvement by one or both parents, and alcohol or drug dependency by one or both parents. This as for Puente's case, her childhood was marked with tragedy, with alcoholic parents and suffered loss of parents at a young age of 8. This has been a factor to Puente's psychopathic killings. A seemingly innocent, sweet old woman who welcomed those in need was instead a psychopath killer. Thank you for listening.